Hello, and welcome to the Old Dominions webinar, Thoughts on a Successful Preparation for the OD 100. My name is Bob Heldebreitel, and I'm the current president of the Old Dominion. This evening, we are honored to have 7 riders that have over 53,000 miles between them, with 219 100-mile starts, 172 100-mile finishes. One rider currently holds the Old Dominion course record, the current course record, for 13 hours, 23 minutes, and 44 seconds. 5 of the riders have done the Tevis 17 times between themselves. In this group, there are 2 riders that have twice completed the Old Dominion and the Tevis in the same year on the same horse. I'm honored to introduce our panelists tonight, Ann Mobain, who is one of the 5, or has done 5 Old Dominion 100 finishes, and is the current holder of that course record, and she's done the Tevis once. We've got Bryn Stevens, who has 6 Old Dominion 100 finishes, and is one of our riders that has finished the Tevis and the Old Dominion twice on the same horse in the same year. She has 3 Tevis finishes. We have Clara Godwin, who has 10 Old Dominion 100 finishes and 6 Tevis finishes. We have Kelly Stoneburner, who has 4 Old Dominion 100 finishes and 1 Tevis finish. We have Sarah Schick, who has 3 Old Dominion 100 finishes. We have John Crandall, who has 9 Old Dominion 100 finishes, 6 of those as first place finishes. And he has 6 Tevis finishes, with 2 of those finished on the same horse used at the Old Dominion. And we have Stag Newman, who has 10 Old Dominion 100 finishes, also has 6 first place finishes. So what we've done is we've come up with several topics for our panelists to answer. And they will answer the questions if you have any questions, put them in the chat and we'll get to those. If they're really pressing, we'll answer them at that moment. Otherwise, we'll wait till the end and answer them at that time. The topics will focus on primarily successfully completing the Old Dominion 100, conditioning, preparation, tack and equipment, shoes and boots, food and electrolytes for horses and humans, ride strategy, and things unique to the Old Dominion. So what we'll do is we'll kick it off with conditioning and preparation, and we'll ask Claire to her opinion of conditioning and preparation for the Old Dominion or a 100 miler. Claire?
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. So I think the Old Dominion 100 was my first 100-mile ride, and actually several other of the people on this board tonight. And it's different from other hundreds, but in some ways I think it's better than other hundreds just because it's a circular course, and which is nicer for the horse's brain, not to have to go back to base camp multiple times and then leave. But the challenges, of course, that are well known are the hills, the mountains, the uphill climbs. So certainly doing a lot of hill work and preparation is important. And I don't mean go out and do 20 miles, 3 times a week of straight hills, but teaching your horse to do hills correctly, specifically being able to have the motor and drive going up the hill, yes, but having the collection to correctly go down the hill to save their front ends. You need to get the weight on the hind end in order to successfully do downhills, particularly if you're going to try and do them with any speed. Your horse has to be acclimated to the heat and humidity that we expect in Virginia in June, and certainly needs to be practiced negotiating rocks, because there are a couple of those out on the Old Dominion trails, just a couple. I don't know how other people acclimate against these issues, but generally the best way to do it is to go out and do it. Now, I know that some people, and maybe the other panelists can speak to this, but have heard of people trying to acclimate horses to heat by overdressing them while training. And I'd like to hear from the other panelists about that, as I've certainly heard some cons about that. Does anyone want to speak to that?
I've never done that, but I know that the year that, oh, I'm blanking on the name, 2001 Pan Am, the winner of that was conditioning in California with a blanket, and she learned that from Becky Hart. My one advice, if you have a horse that is coming particularly from a low humidity environment, almost shave the horse, and then lots of water, sponge it on, take it off. Unlike low humidity, that water won't evaporate off, so you have to take the water off as soon as it warms. And if you live out east like we do, get out and condition in the humid weather, even though it may not be your favorite time. That would be my thoughts.
I've found that I always felt like it isn't that hard to start to trigger that adaptation to be ready for the heat of summer, but it does take about a couple of months. And so if it's a horse that I've had in the South for other rides and events, you're actually already well ahead. It's not like your horse has to go out and work every day in his training program to get ready, be prepared for the heat. He just needs to have a couple of heat stresses, a month or so, a couple of months before the ride, to start waking up that transfer of circulatory system from the winter mode where he's got all the blood off of his skin to the summer mode where he's flushing all the blood in through his skin a lot more. And it just takes a few slaps to his system several weeks before the Old Dominion for that to have come around in time. It's not like you have to do it a lot. I don't think you have to do that a whole lot.
I think one of my concerns in mentioning the overdressing of a horse in conditioning for a ride like this is that I've heard, and maybe Kelly can address this based on her equine practice, that you can create anhydrosis in horses by stressing the sweating system too much, trying to do something like that. Kelly, are you here?
Yes, I would have to agree with you, Claire. I think that would be pretty risky.
Yeah.
For that reason, to cause anhydrosis?
Yes, or just also, I can think of a lot of other problems you could cause, just like sores, rubbing, anhydrosis for sure. And then I just feel like that would be pretty dangerous.
Right.
If you didn't do it right.
So while that's something that you might hear for rapid acclimatization to humidity, the panel all agrees that that's not a good idea. In terms of hill work, what is some of your standard workouts prior to going into not a race to the finish necessarily, but a completion? The rest of the panelists, I know what mine is. I tend to, as I say, I don't tend to do 20 miles 3 times a week, but rather kind of over months and months do 10 or 15 miles of hills a couple times a week, interspersed with some other work. What about some of the other panelists?
I probably undertrain, just even in the years when the 5-year Super won, but we would do one hard workout a week, and that would be 10 to 20 miles with maybe 2,000 to 3,000, even 4,000 feet of climbing, and I'd trot and maybe hand gallop up most of the climbing. Couple equitation times a week, because I think so important and part of the training is rhythm, balance, and alignment, and having those small muscles and tendons and ligaments able to handle the stress of the rocks and the uneven terrain. And you get that through dressage training and through training on rough terrain. And that would pretty much be it. And then I would peak 2 weeks before and make sure the horses have plenty of rest and are very sound coming into the ride. So I believe if you have a horse with years of base, save the miles for the competition, and do intense training once a week.
Certainly.
Yeah,
agree.
mine is pretty similar where, my horse basically gets worked twice, 2 to 3 times a week, with one of those rides being his longer conditioning ride. And then I build it, I kind of take it the same way as you would take a half marathon training plan, where you build up over the weeks or a couple of months, to where you have kind of that peak area where I like to peak about 4 weeks out, and then start to taper back down. And then the week before the ride, just keep it loose and easy. But where I live, it's flat. So we actually are very fortunate. And if anyone is somewhat close to Central Virginia, we have a perfect training ground. So we will go up to this camping area and this mountain area and ride up into Shenandoah, and to spend basically a weekend kind of boot camp, with that slow mountain climbing on trail that's basically exactly like OD, to get that concussion training, but also the mountain work in, so that we're ready for it.
Yeah, I also wanted to add, if anything, I probably undertrain for Old Dominion and for Tevis. If anything, I mean, we also have really flat trails. I think we really prioritize long, slow distance and just the routine of the AERC schedule. I think we're really lucky with how rides pan out. I think we ride each ride accordingly, like to the fitness of our horses and to the strengths of our horses and also the weaknesses of our horses. But I think we also prioritize things like electrolytes and fuel. And not every horse is going to be an OD winner, and not every horse is going to be a Tevis winner, and not every horse is going to be like a flat sandy winner. Like it's you just have to pay attention to things like what is going to be their strengths and what is going to be their weaknesses.
Yeah, I just like to build on what Bren said, because I think that's so important. Know your horse strengths and weaknesses, because the Old Dominion will give you an opportunity to use your horse's strengths. They're long, fairly level stretches of road, dirt road. And if your horse's strength, like John's great horse Heraldic, is big hand gallop, use that to your advantage. Your horse's strength is dancing over the rocks, like my horse JL Supers, use that. If you have a horse that's not a great climbing horse, then take plenty of breaks on the uphill and use the downhills. But play to your horse's strengths, and equally important, understand your horse's limitations and don't overface the horse because you ask him to do something that's not his strengths.
And I'd like to interject here. One of my favorite things about our sport is getting the maximum amount of miles from each of our horses. And part of that is saving the horse. And so I rarely go fast going up hills. But I try to have my horses trained to go downhill very well. And that saves a lot of energy at the end of the day. If your horse is heavy on the forehand though, and is beating itself down the hill, then you're not even going to finish, and all that energy will be wasted. But I think that's huge. And the other thing is, if you have a young horse versus an older horse, that is huge on the amount of conditioning that you need to do prior to going to the Old Dominion. If this horse is one that's done several hundreds in the past, and their strengths and weaknesses, then you really need to brush up a little bit on each one of those weaknesses before you go, and most of it is rest.
I think with conditioning too, it's important to also stay consistent. You want to, like I mentioned, have marathon training plan. You want to be training as long as it's safe, weather conditions allowing, because you don't want to risk an injury. It's important to keep your conditioning, ride them at least once a week, but keep that going. And just as important is also their rest. One of the things that I have found, my horse is well over a decade team now and has almost 3,000 miles, I believe, over 3,000. But one of the most important things in keeping him going that far in that longevity is just the importance of his rest period, not only after a competition, but also in training, to allow him to recover and prevent injury and everything like that. And also just protect his mental and emotional well-being too. So train consistently, but also be aware that rest is just as important.
And I would add to that, one difference, having lived out and competed successfully out west and back east, is your horses may need more rest after competitions and training. If the footing is rugged, which it will be on the Old Dominion, out in California, I once did 900s in 1 year and the horse looked great at the end of the year, but the footing was very forgiving on many of the rides out there. After the Old Dominion, my horse gets 4 weeks of rest. So
Agreed.
just plan. I think the rest is so important.
You have to remember the basic exercise physiology maximum, that there's really two components to improving the strength of anything, and that's the stress and then the rest. And the rest is absolutely as important. And it's important that you make sure it's really quality rest, because most of our breakdowns happen because the rest wasn't as truly a quality of rest as you thought. And that meant instead of going through strengthening cycles, you went through a cyclic failure where you didn't have time to be fully reset and ready for the next workout before it came. And so it is important to have your horses rest, and resting somewhere where you can observe them while they're resting, so that if something's gone wrong with their rest, if they've been stressed out, if they've been pacing too much when they should have been just grazing in the pasture, because all of those things set you up for a cyclic failure that looks like an injury caused by your workouts. And really, it's just as much caused by the absence of the right rest periods.
Good point.
We have a question in the chat. How do you condition a young horse?
And this is one of the reasons why you hear so many people, we have such a hard time being specific about telling somebody how to train or giving you an exact program, because the training program to get a young horse ready for his first time here is going to be a lot different, as people have already alluded to, than for a horse that's done this over and over again, and you only need to tickle a few features of his performance back awake again and all the bases there. But all of my young horses had done most of 18 months to 2 years of just lots of long trail rides and rest and long rest cycles. And so they didn't have to be ridden for that first year, or what I call base development. They don't have to be ridden that often, but they do have to go out every week or two and do something several hours long. And competitive trail rides actually are a great place to take a youngster for their first times out, because it gives you a chance to get those long base miles in an environment that somewhat simulates what they're going to experience in an endurance ride, and without quite this, and the experience of being the stress around other horses, so you can see how much that affects him and whether you need to work more at that. And I think that's very important, because a lot of us underestimate how much one young horse might be stressed by being in the crowd of strange horses. while others are completely cool with it. And you don't know that at first. And a lot of people, I think, going to a competitive trail ride gives you a little more subdued environment. We've got more opportunity to focus on that if your horse is got some crowd anxiety, and stay there doing that kind of event until you feel like you've got your crowd anxiety problem solved, because it's hard to deal with that once you get him too fit and far along doing endurance races. You're kind of caught and you're not in the best environment to try and deal with those strange horse crowd stresses. And like that varies a lot between horses. One young horse will be just cool right off. You know, I had Hybrid Vigor. He did one competitive trail ride. He was such a Joe Cool that I didn't have to do too many more with him. His next ride was the Old Dominion 100. And he did great.
Let me totally agree with John. You know, my wife's horse that won the AOC National Championship 50 on the OD course, going away, was one of these like that, you know, totally cool, nothing bothered him. My horse Super that won the Old Dominion 5 times, the Old Dominion was a great course for him because he did not deal well with lots of horses, and he'd, you know, get race brain. But the Old Dominion is a course that you can quickly get in a small group. You won't see other horses. And I would go out near the back of the pack and just maintain a steady pace. So really, as John said, knowing your horse, and if your horse only does well in small groups, the Old Dominion will allow you to ride that type ride, because you won't see all the other horses galloping across the field like you would in a Florida ride or a lot of other rides.
For people like me that tend to do a lot of 50-mile rides before I will put a horse in a 100, which, you know, I think the take-home message is there's not one way to do these things. There's a lot of factors involved, but for me, one thing that I'm very cognizant of is if I'm planning 100 for the first time on a horse and I'm doing a series of 50-mile rides before, I want to make sure that all those 50-mile rides are truly building this horse up to a completion, not necessarily, you know, don't want to race those 50-mile rides prior to a 100-mile ride for the first time. And also be very aware that multiple 50-mile rides on the year leading up to a 100-mile ride may make you arrive at the ride with a horse with ulcers. And so you need to practice a lot of ulcer prevention. You do it that way. Ulcer prevention, of course, is ensuring that your horse is eating in the trailer during the travel times, using gastric protectants as allowed by AERC before, during, and after a ride, each time.
And Claire, along the previous comment that you had made, we have a question about prior to the OD 100, when would you do your last ride? And how long would you do, a 50 or a 75?
I have and will probably do in the future a 50, roughly 3 weeks ahead of time. If I needed to deal with something behaviorally, you know, race brain or otherwise, I might be talked into doing a slow 50 2 weeks ahead of time. But, you know, I think they go into it fresher if you take Sarah's approach and a month ahead of time, don't do any competitions. But there again, I think it depends on the horse and what you're trying to do.
All right, let's move along to tack and equipment. And Kelly, do you have, you want to start this one off if you can?
Sure. And I'm sorry, guys, I'm driving home from work, so I don't have my computer up. So I'm sorry I don't have the screen. But I will say too that, you know, some component of this talk today was kind of differences between, you know, the Old Dominion and Tevis. And I will say that, you know, the rides out west, it seems like you'd have a lot more options with different boots and shoes that can be glued on versus, you know, on the east with the humidity and, you know, just the wet environment and a lot of mud, it definitely is a lot trickier. And so I think the really main take home message is, for me, you know, kind of along with and in line with the conditioning, is really just a matter of knowing your horse and knowing that horse so well on the terrain and the type of ride that you are anticipating encountering. And so for the Old Dominion, you know, like Claire alluded to, just the few rocks that are on that trail that you might see, you know, knowing how your horses handle that. And, you know, all horses are going to be very different. With that, you know, some horses may be able to just dance right over those rocks and not have a problem. And some horses may be really sensitive. And so doing a ride like No Frills that's very similar terrain and, you know, training on terrain that's going to be similar to the Old Dominion, I think is going to be really important, because, you know, you may have easy boots or something that work really well in the flat terrain, but as soon as you start going up a really steep climb with rocks, they may all come flying off. And so taking the time to know your horse and, you know, figure out what kind of, you know, hoof protection is going to work for them. And then with that up and down, you know, having something like a crupper may be something you end up needing with both the Old Dominion and Tevis, with all of the elevation changes. You know, tack is very different if you're just training on the flat. And so, like, I like how Sarah said with, you know, going to train at Graves or something like that, where you're going to get a lot of that up and down. I just think that that's going to be really important when it comes to your tack. And then, you know, kind of that old rule of don't try something for the first time on a ride like the Old Dominion 100. You kind of want to have, you know, idea of something you've really tested out for your horse, because they are all very different, I think, especially when it comes to hoof care.
Yeah, and I think Old Dominion, my perspective is getting the right shoeing is the most important part of success. Behind me, I have pictures of horses that represent 7 OD non-completions. 5 of those 7 were shoeing issues. Fortunately, they also represent 15 completions. John Crandall was my farrier in Virginia, and I had to get John to train my farrier when I moved to North Carolina. But you know, carry easy boots, have spare shoes at the holds with your crew. And then on the shoeing, I'll let John say more about this, but most important, make sure there's no overhang anywhere on the shoes where the rocks will take them off, because, you know, if there's overhang on the heel or overhang on the side, the rocks will just strip them off. And John, why don't I turn it over to you, because you're the expert on shoeing for Old Dominion.
Yeah, it's not a place for exotic ideas or thoughts that you're going to give the horse extra support or anything like that. And you have to have some faith that nature did intend for them to do this. You don't really need to get exotic. It's really more about help fitting him to exactly what he's got and supporting him to develop the best hoof he's got in the time in the year before, as you're preparing, and trying to plan ahead so that you're setting him up so he has his best hoof on that day, which is a lot of it. As far as the shoeing that day, we're getting more and more high-tech alternatives, you know, and plastics that are good alternatives now, and they're becoming a little more viable all the time. And I've certainly tried all of them up until the last few years, to some extent. And one of the issues that you're going to have if you want to try some of the newer shoes, particularly the ones that glue on, or what I think there's a lot of future there. But if you are on the East Coast and preparing to ride at the Old Dominion, the real problem with those that you and your farrier might run into is having perfect conditions to mount the shoes, because they're very humidity and dampness sensitive to getting a good bond and a good mounting on those shoes. And so I wouldn't recommend going to those newer glue-on type mountings unless you're ready to do everything it takes to make sure your farrier will have a perfect environment and a perfectly dry hoof. I mean, not just dry, but bone dry to be able to do that kind of work. And that's one of the things that sort of kept me from using them more often. There's a lot of advantages of those shoes. The shoe that I ended up going towards the most is a fairly light steel shoe, not a very robust one. Usually fullered all the way around, something we'd call a rim shoe. Often with a little bit of boreum, but not much, a very little bit, just 4 points in 4 different little positions on the shoe. That's all it takes to make them not slip on rocks. And if they're well balanced, it doesn't interfere. I usually used a fairly thin but hard pad on the sole. For myself, I seldom actually even packed the pad. I just drilled 3/8-inch diameter holes at the end of the pad, right up against behind the toe of the shoe. That lets sand out so that you don't get a sand wad up there under the tip of P3 of the coffin bone, because that's the place that sand will bruise under a pad. And that's something, if you wear padded shoes, you should be checking every vet check to make sure you aren't getting sand under your pad. After that, it's really down to the basics, fitting and balancing. You're going to find that the Old Dominion is quite a bit more critical about footfall balance. In other words, if you consider the different aspects of how to balance a hoof, there's balance of getting it under a foot that's well shaped and neatly under the bony column that doesn't flare off to one side and take the base to one side or the other. But on the Old Dominion, since we do a lot of running on very hard ground and the roads tend to be very firm, by midsummer, your horse is going to be really sensitive to footfall balance issues where his ground strike and his foot doesn't land and hit the ground flat. A well-balanced and trimmed hoof should be able to go trotting down the road and sound like coconut hitting. You should never hear that kind of double strike sound where one corner leads at touching the ground and then he flops down on it, because that means your horse is enduring a lot more stress on one edge of his joints, and he will feel that by the end of the day. That's what starts to make him feel unhappy with his legs by the end of the day. There's it in a nutshell.
Like Stag, I was blessed to have John work on my horses when both from many of the Old Dominion rides at hundreds that I've done, but also I think, John, for every Tevis that I've done, you've been there for me. And one interesting thing that he did that I might share is always suggested that we pull the shoes 2 weeks before the ride and travel from the East Coast to the West Coast barefoot. And if you expand upon why you suggested that, John.
Well, because usually because we planned well ahead with our shoeing cycles, we had pretty much planned that you had a worn out set of shoes coming up just before you were shipping anyway, and the horses were due to be trimmed. But particularly in the shipment to the Tevis Cup, it's nice to get their shoes off. And my horses, one of the advantages of me shoeing for myself is my horses most often get several days barefoot between each shoeing. In other words, I could pull my shoes off, the horses, round them gently, let them go out in the pastures, walk around, let their feet find its own nature and shape. And it's a way to sort of double check and make sure you aren't as careful as I am. I know it's easy to sort of build in little deformations to your horse's hoof shape, and letting them have a few minutes to go barefoot or a few days, a day or two to go barefoot between shoeings really helps them pull their hooves back together to their most natural shape. And it's particularly important going to the Tevis Cup in the dry environment there after living in the east where everything's very humid, because your horse's hoof actually changes shape a little bit just for being in that environment. And you want the shoe fitted to what his nature is in that environment. So if you pull the shoes off, for instance, going to the Tevis, they travel out there barefoot, their feet have got a good rest from shoes, and then they get a day or two in that dry environment for the hoof to take the shape it wants in that humidity. And then they get fitted to that and shod.
Well, and I think you also mentioned over the years that having that metal shoe vibrating in a trailer for all that time was another factor that you wanted to take out.
Yeah, it's just not, and it's not necessary. You know, it's, my horses, like I said, they spend a surprising amount of their year barefoot, even when they're in heavy training. They've always got little breaks. I just always tell people, if you don't plan a break, they're going to give you one. And so it's better to just sort of keep planning those little breaks and let them come back to nature.
And keep picking up the rocks in your field.
Yeah, but they get used to that. I mean, that's it works.
So
And the neat
I'm
thing
gonna-
is nowadays people worry a lot of, oh, I'm going to chip a hoof on a rock or something like that. The reality is those kind of little chips that you might get for going barefoot, they're all very repairable nowadays. It's not that big a deal. We have good materials for fixing little nicks like that.
Can I
So
also
I'm gonna-
elaborate on
go ahead,
on the
please.
last, sorry, the last question that was asked about it was about sorry, I'm losing it. It was about
concerned with the new farrier to fit shoes.
yes. Okay. So John has been lucky enough to be able to make it out with us to Tevis a number of times. So I've watched him do Claire's horses a number of times, once actually getting to California. And watching him do horses' feet is like watching someone, it's like watching Picasso. John is very talented. I see him smirking. Yeah. So John has actually made it out a number of times for Claire and her horses. So that answers that question. But also the question prior was about leather pads. And I've used leather pads on hundreds before, and they do end up completely shredded after completing the Old Dominion. They almost never, actually, I don't think I've had leather pads last an entire 50. I've had vets recommend me to screw into like the toe of the pad and let things come out the toe of the pad. It has never worked. We always fill our pads. We always pack them. It never works to just leave them unpacked and to let things come out the toe. But I personally always go into the OD 100 with 4 shoes, Boreum, and 4 pads, 4 just rubber pads.
Right.
A little off topic, but John does always make his way out to Tevis pretty much. If he has a client whose horses are doing Tevis, John makes it out there. He's wonderful for that.
I've had good luck with the pour-in pads. I think it
Yeah.
really, it pretty much excludes the possibility of, a rock getting your sole. It keeps the shoes on better.
It does.
It provides uniform weight-bearing surface, which is nice if you have a degree of caudal heel pain, as far as I know. At least that's what Kelly can speak to more as an equine clinician about that, but it seems to work for mine.
I'm going to add, just as a newbie with the OD crowd, is that all hoof protection is required for all OD rides too.
Mhm.
And I've seen a lot of intro newbie riders come in and not have shoes, and or they take boots off, and you don't want to do that on an OD ride. Sorry, I had to pop in, just make a plug for we need shoes on OD rides.
When Governor Spotswood made the first exhibition to try and demonstrate that they were going to open up the Shenandoah Valley, in the colonial days, the first governor of Virginia, and they formed the Knights of the Golden Horseshoe to go over the famous Blue Ridge Mountain in an exhibition ride and down the other side. And one of the novel things about that exhibition was they realized all their horses would have to be shod, because most workhorses in the tidewater flatlands and the better soils, even working horses back in the colonial days, nobody spent money for shoes. But they recognized that you weren't going to get over the Blue Ridge Mountain if you didn't shoe your horse. And that's why they named the exhibition the Knights of the Golden Horseshoe.
It's a
Thank you. I
great,
did not know that.
interesting
history.
information. I'm going to move away from shoes, move the conversation away from shoes and boots, because we also have tack and equipment. And I wanted to see if Sarah or Kelly or anybody else wants to add information about tack or equipment.
I think the important thing is to, we were saying, even with conditioning, trying to get on similar trail as much as possible. You want to go in the tack that you're planning on going on ride day in similar terrain as much as possible, so that you can test it and you know what you need, and you know if it's going to work or what problems it's going to have. If you need breast collar, most folks use a breast collar. A lot of folks use a crupper, or I see that breeching is getting to be more popular, which really helps to keep the saddle in place on your uphill and downhill. Of course, you want your saddle fit well. Along with that, in your crew area, I always have some basic backup items, like a backup saddle pad, maybe a girth, zip ties in case something breaks. And along with that, I go in horseshoes and keep boots basically as my spare tire, so that if I lose a shoe, I have something to get me to the next fold. Saddle pack is very important, because you've got long stretches in between the vet checks where you're not going to see anyone. So you need to be able to carry your own hydration and snacks with you, as well as electrolytes to get you through. And I think that's pretty much all I have for when I go through. I'm pretty bare bones. My saddle pack, I have snacks and electrolytes for myself, as well as a bottle of water and usually a bottle of Pedialyte. And then like a hoof pick and boots, and that's all I carry.
Let me just emphasize one piece of equipment you mentioned there that I really dislike, but I always do it on the Old Dominion. That's breastplate. I normally don't. I wasn't one year on the Old Dominion on JL Super, and he ended up on a steep uphill. The saddle ended up as a leather jock strap. He was not happy. I was not happy as he's bucking around me. Fortunately, everybody stopped, helped me out. That's one of the great things about Old Dominion, is this part of the culture. You'll stop and help other people, and we finished the ride. But I think breastplate is critical because of the steep climbs.
I think it's already been said here, but it's really important that you that you try all your equipment in the same terrain, and particularly those climbs. And note that I usually always rode with a breast collar, but I endeavored to make sure that my saddle fit so well it almost wasn't needed. And a good fitting saddle tends to sock into the right spot on the horse and doesn't need to be girth terribly tight or have a lot of pressure and help from a breast collar or a crupper. If the saddle really fits your horse well, it'll stay where it belongs with only a little bit of help from a breast collar at all, if at all.
And I think if you're doing mountain work where there's a lot of rocks, some vet route to stem a bleeder, because the sharp rocks will do it. Can
Yeah.
save the ride also.
It's a good point.
Okay, let's move along to food and electrolytes. Bryn? You want to start that one off,
Hello.
please?
Yeah, of course. So as a runner, I'm really lucky because I get to deplete myself of electrolytes all the time. So I get to understand exactly what horses feel like when they're completely depleted. I've met a number of people that don't believe in electrolytes. I would like to stress the importance that even if you go in with a tube of Light Now or MyoGuard or anything is absolutely better than nothing. Everyone has usually a tube of something. We do make our own electrolytes. Like my mother and I also make our own electrolytes. All of our horses are on a little special of a combination, but it's important to have salt. It's important to have potassium. It's important to replenish whatever you're losing. You have to think that the diet of humans is so much more limited, or sorry, so much more vast than the diet of horses, which is so much more limited. Anyway, I think it's important to keep that in mind. I'd like to just keep this short and explain that if you have questions on electrolytes, it's important to reach out to one of us personally. But having a tube of just basic electrolytes is better than nothing. Electrolytes are important. You just need to replenish what you're losing. Whenever you sweat, you're losing electrolytes. As an ultra runner, whenever you're sweating, you're losing electrolytes, even as a rider. So even for people, like I usually ride off of Tailwind, but if not, you'll usually see me licking like a piece of like a pretzel. I one time stole someone's like hard rod pretzels off of their crewing table, just to like lick salt. So it's important to always have salt and always have something to just replenish whatever you're losing. Even if it's cold out, you're usually sweating. So I'm sorry that was really brief, but Claire, go next.
I have a question for Kelly. The Southeast Sierra has their scales, and they've shared what they have with us, and I think Old Dominion now has a set of horse scales. They also have touted the use of their blood chemistry machine. So Kelly, what is your take on if you really want to adjust your electrolytes like I have, since Performing Wind that I used for years and years is no longer available? Do you think that we should draw chemistry at the conclusion of a 50 and adjust as necessary leading up to doing attempting 100, especially on a new horse with new electrolytes? Do you think that is helpful, or do you think that you're sequestering potassium stuff so that the peripheral blood really doesn't tell you what you need to know? What's your take on that?
Well, I think that would be really cool and really interesting if we could do that. I also feel like the numbers sometimes maybe don't always correlate with how the horse looks. And so I think that, even if we're lacking on numbers and we're not able to do like blood work at the end of a ride and adjust there, because like you said, if we measure the blood, that's not telling us their whole body. And there are so many factors that affect those numbers on paper that we're seeing. And so if, a horse could have a low blood value of, you know, say potassium, but they could have the potassium in their cells. They may just not be able to utilize it if they have an imbalance and don't have the other electrolytes they need. So I think that, yeah, that would be really awesome information, but also I think we have just such great information by looking at our horses and, you know, how tired do they look? Do they ever have, you know, are they having muscle fasciculations, or are they thumping? Do they have anything going on there? And those are always huge learning opportunities, I guess, for us to evaluate things. I remember getting pulled at the end of the 55, and Claire, you came up and kind of consoled me after that. My horse was thumping. I had screwed up my electrolytes that day.
We've all been there.
Yep.
For
And
sure.
so I hate to say that, you know, it too, but I just feel like there's going to always just be that trial and error of us learning things the hard way. And, you know, I know this is a little off topic from what we were just talking about, but moving out west and living in Colorado has been like really eye-opening, kind of the differences in electrolyte use, you know, of different riders in different parts of the country, and just how horses adjust to not having humidity. And, you know, out here, your horse can be sweating all day, but they never got wet. You just have a little, you know, crystals all over their, you know, hair, versus in, you know, Virginia or some of those Southeast rides, you know, the horse stays wet all day, and you may not really realize how much sweat they've actually lost through that day. But and one more quick thing too, I think riding out west really makes you realize how much electrolytes the rider loses. I feel like we get parched pretty quick out here, and if you don't do electrolytes, especially when you're at high elevation, I feel like it hits you pretty fast.
Yeah.
And that's because the air is less, there's less moisture in the air, so you're evaporating through your respiratory tract quicker.
Yeah, it's pretty
Yeah.
quick, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I would
think,
also like to, oh, you can go first.
oh, I was going to say, I'd love to see some research on this. I actually think you can get a horse in trouble a lot more quickly out west than back east, because in heat and humidity, you want to slow down and the horse wants to slow down. But I haven't seen deep research on that. What I just wanted to add here, a point that previous speaker made. Look at your horse, let your horse tell you, and there's no harm, and I've done this, to stay in the hold an extra 20 or 30 minutes and let your horse, you know, rehydrate and also get more nutrition. It's amazing how quickly these horses will recover if you give them time, and then you can go out and have a nice, good next leg. One thing I was taught by either Meg Sleeper or John Crandall is date syrup is something that can be very useful. I carry a little plastic container of date syrup and will give my horses a shot of date syrup on trail. It's a complex carbohydrate. Avoid simple sugars for yourself and your horse. But it's something they did in the Mideast, is use date syrup if you need to give your horse a lift on trail. And I actually use dates for myself. I carry a whole pack of dates for myself on trail and eat steadily.
Yes.
There's a question in the chat room. Can you overdo electrolytes, and what will the effect be?
Claire could probably give a better explanation to this, but I have over
Kelly's a
electrolyted.
large animal veterinarian here. But I mean, I think for the most part, they're just going to pee them out and you're going to waste money. But you certainly can burn a hole in their stomach doing that.
Or stop them from eating.
Yeah. And I have seen hypercalcemia occur as well in my own horse. But Kelly, what do you think about that question?
Yeah, you have to be careful. It's all a balancing act, and you have to be giving them all of the electrolytes that they need, because they help each other. So some of the electrolytes can only get absorbed in the company of other ones. So if you're lacking in like something like magnesium, they can't absorb the calcium they need. So it can get a little complicated for sure.
Sometimes it's important to not miss the right moment to give them some electrolytes, because there's no better time to give your horse, because if you give them too much, the problem with giving them too much on an endurance ride isn't likely to be that you actually gave them more electrolytes than you can handle. You gave them, but you can easily give them enough to make them not want to, make their stomach uncomfortable, and then they don't eat. And then they might even drink less because their stomach's uncomfortable. And the best time to be giving them electrolytes is when is following a small drink, even a small one. And it's a good time to go ahead and put the electrolytes in, because they've already got some more water to buffer it in their stomach right at that moment.
And I like what Claire said earlier about the gastroprotectants. I think that's a thing to consider when you are, competing in the sport and we're asking them to do some things that are a little more stressful than they would on their own.
I think it's also important, because there was a question in the chat too, which about how if you preload before the ride and everything. I think it depends on the individual person, but whether you preload or not, and during the ride, it's important to have a plan, knowing the loops of the trail, the stretches between them, and where you're headed on when you're going to electrolyte. That's something I do for pretty much every ride, is plan like, okay, on this loop, I'm going to electrolyte halfway through, then the vet check. This next stretch is going to be like, for example, the stretch between Bucktail and Big 92. I know I am probably going to electrolyte twice. I actually have been on trail with some well-experienced OD riders that didn't do that. And then their horse, cramped at the next hold and didn't finish because of it. He was fine. Just some butt muscles that got tired. But I think it's important for you to look through the course and kind of have that idea in your head on when you're going to electrolyte your horse. For food, I give my guy basically a smorgasbord of whatever I could possibly offer him at every hold, other than at Laurel Run, where, we don't, the first time through, you don't have crew there, but Diane in ride management, they do a great job of bringing out hay and grain and beet pulp for your horse to eat. And then for people, for me, for 100s, I'm a fitness geek and, very into eating healthy at home. But when it comes to a 100-mile ride, it's game on. It's basically whatever is going to feel good in my stomach, and whatever calories I can get in that taste good and then I can get down and keep down, whether that be oatmeal cream pies at mile 75, or a can of, I know Mary Howell likes a can of cold chicken soup because it's got extra sodium in it. Whatever sounds good to you, because you're going to be working so hard that really you're going to burn through everything that you're putting into your system anyway. So you need to make sure that you're keeping your energy and sugar levels up as well as your horse, so that you can get through and still ride well.
So go ahead.
Oh, yeah. And I found that eating steadily on trail, a little bit at a time, really helps at the OD, because you do have long stretches between checkpoints. So eating steadily with stuff that is, high fiber, low non-structural carbohydrates. And then somebody already said a key thing was Pedialytes. My wife was having trouble completing 100s until she learned about Pedialytes, and women of a past menopause in particular are very subject to electrolyte imbalance, but Pedialytes is a wonderful thing to use as your fluid. And she successfully won in a terribly hot day. She actually won after learning about Pedialyte.
Yeah, Pedialyte is great because it's easily accessible. I know Bryn mentioned that she uses Tailwind. Tailwind is also awesome. Hammer Nutrition makes great products. There's also one that I really like called Infinite. Those products can be a little bit more expensive and harder to find, because they're kind of more geared towards ultra running, triathlon, and all of that. So if you're kind of looking for more over the counter, less expensive stuff, Pedialyte is a great alternative.
And I think with horses and humans, some good advice I've heard was electrolyting early and often, because once you get into that hole,
Yeah.
Pretty hard to come back from it, both on the human and horse side.
Yeah, you don't want to get into a spot where where you're in a hole and you've got to be giving them electrolytes now that they're tired. You want to have done, if anything, a little more than you're guessing you need early so that you can coast home with less.
One of the things that has fascinated me, especially during the Tevis Cup, is that, and we'll get into strategy in a little bit, but they run the course there differently in that there's only 2 long holds where a horse can really chow down, but there's multiple gate and goes. And so you come into those gate and goes at Tevis, and you're waiting for your horse to come down, and he's stuffing his face, and that's good, but it only lasts if your horse is fit, 5 minutes or so. And yes, you can stay there, but if you're trying to run competitive, you don't want to stay there too long. So that's a lot of strategy. But your horse is going to be breaking down fat all day during a 100-mile ride. So you do need to acclimate your horse to the metabolic processes of breaking down fat by feeding them fat, so they know how to metabolize it. It actually takes them a while to learn how to do that. So we feed a lot of beet pulp at home, and I don't feed beet pulp at rides. I know it's got a lot of water in it and stuff, but I feel like they're doing a lot of fat breakdown at rides anyway. I don't necessarily need to give them fats in addition to that. What do other riders feel about that? Anybody ever think about that?
Yeah, I was taught that fat fed in a ride is too late to be effective. You want them going into the ride with the fat already on their body, but the fat of the day of the ride, they probably aren't going to break down.
Right, what you're feeding then. What I've learned with myself, and I believe it applies somewhat to the horses too, is that your body's ability to utilize the fat that is on your body for fuel is something that you have to condition as well. And it's been shown, and I've felt it exactly myself. If you experience times where you have to work through a bit of a sugar low and haven't been fed well and have a long day's work, you will react to that experience by waking up your body's ability to rapidly break down fat. And it's something that, again, it doesn't have to be challenged often, but if we live with too reliable a feed, too reliable a diet, we tend to lose some of our ability to rapidly break down fat. And if we occasionally have a bit of a small fasting day where we exercise anyway, you're actually exercising your body's ability to switch over and rapidly start breaking down fat.
So you're talking about fasting, but that is perhaps how to turn on fat metabolism in a human,
Yes.
but not necessarily something you want to do with a horse, because the ulcerogenic.
Well, and yes, that is true. But horses always need to be eating a little.
Right.
And one of the great things about the Old Dominion ride, and one of the advantages we have here, is if you sharpen your eye for it, there is grass to eat everywhere. There's little tufts of it coming along, and on the Old Dominion ride, if you have a slow spot going up a mountainside, it's fair game to teach your horse he can grab anything he doesn't have to slow down for. And if I'm off the horse in front of him, I'm grabbing little bits of grass here and there, reaching down and grabbing it myself and holding it out behind me to just keep him as constantly as possible, having at least some little nibble in his mouth. And the psychological satisfaction that comes from having his normal day's chew time, even if he's only playing with a few pieces of grass in his mouth, it still keeps his brain working and his mind on digestion.
I love that, John. And I feel like that's a huge part of why I really think the Old Dominion is really one of the best first hundreds for horses.
Yeah, and learning to use what's there in nature around you constantly and getting those little nibbles of grass. We have grass that grows in tufts all along the trail. We've got sometimes even some clover or some wild alfalfa, or even the crown vetch that they throw for stabilization along roadsides. And you'll see that all of those things are really good for their stomach.
So we have a really good question in the chat about how you know if you and your horse are new to the sport, how do you know when they need electrolytes and what is a good one to start with? My personal opinion is if your horse looks like they need electrolytes, you're probably already behind the 8 ball. All of us, I guarantee you pretty much everyone in this group is going to have a different answer to their pattern and how they electrolyte. My typical go-to, so the few days leading up to a ride, I will dose once or twice a day at home, depending on how hot and humid it is that time of year. And then at the ride, I'll give them a dose when I get there the night before, the morning of, skip. I won't elite on the first loop. And then pretty much every loop after that, unless it's shorter than 10 miles, I'm going to give them a dose halfway through the loop and then at the hold. That's my pattern that I've used for years. It works great. I'm sure that other folks have other patterns that work awesome. I still use Enduramax, which can be a little bit caustic to their stomach. My guy has a stomach like a freaking tank, so I don't have to worry about that. But I know that other folks have used the Finish Line electrolytes, and that's worked really well too. Claire mentioned Perform and Win, which unfortunately is discontinued. And then one that I don't see very often anymore, but I know folks have used, is Kentucky Games. I also mix mine with kale and pectin. So you can use Pro CMC, you can use, I think applesauce makes it more acidic. I know folks have tried yogurt, you can do it with just water. Or you can also, if they'll eat it, put it in their food. My guy will not eat it if you put it in his food. So I like being able to syringe, because then you know that they're getting the dose that they need when you're giving it to them and at the appropriate time. So I don't know if anyone else wants to weigh in on their opinion on that, because there's no one right answer, but hopefully that helps a little bit.
Yeah, I use a date syrup as a carrier. I think something that helps them absorb that is a complex carbohydrate is good. Meg Sleeper sort of taught me that. And Meg, who's an equine cardiologist, is sort of my go-to person. Plus, she's completed 80 some hundreds. And she actually, I use a product called, I think Endurocell is the product we use. But I think the most important is using regular doses, not too large, lots of regular small doses with a good carrier.
All right, let's move along to ride strategy. Stag?
Okay, I'm going to start out with 4 words. I would urge people to write those words down, write it on the palm of your hand. And they're words taught to me by Matthew McKay Smith, who was one of the early ARC presidents, and the first person to complete and win Tevis and Old Dominion in the same year, and the mentor to John, Jeannie, myself. It's never hurry, never tarry. Never hurry, never tarry. That's the key to, I think, any ride, but particularly the Old Dominion. By that, I mean, never waste time. Trot, don't walk. Walk is harder on a horse than a trot. If you walk a horse for a mile, their heartbeat will be between 12 and 1400 beats. If you trot a well-trained horse for a mile, it's between 700 and 800. The horse is made to trot or easy hand gallop. If they're trained to do that, it's even better. Save your walking for the really tough terrain, steep uphill, the stegosaurus, petrified stegosaurus spine that's in the second loop, muddy stuff. But never hurry. I try to avoid getting my horse out of the aerobic range. So if I'm trotting a steady uphill, which I'll do because my horses are trained to do that, but if I think they're getting out of the aerobic range, then I will walk until I think they're ready to trot again. Now you can monitor with a heart monitor. I used to do that a lot until I knew my horses better. But learn what your horse is telling you about and stay within that aerobic range. And also, very importantly, save horse on the Old Dominion. I think John could probably agree with this, but I frequently never near the front early on in the ride because most people go out too fast until people started pacing off me when my horse was winning. Nowadays, if you pace off my horse, you'll probably finish. You probably won't win. You'll be an hour and a half behind Bren because I have a horse that I know is not, he's a really good top 10 horse. He's not a first to finish horse. So that second part of that is know your horse and ride to your horse's strengths and limitations. But again, I'll come back to the main points. Never hurry, never tarry. A couple other quick points, and I'll turn it over to others. I think it's very useful to ride in small groups with riding partners. I've ridden the last 70 miles of the Old Dominion alone. We did well. We won that year, but it wasn't a lot of fun. And your horse is probably not going to enjoy it. So I try to get into a small group with riding partners, and then you can help each other, talk to each other, etc. And I think that I'll just wrap it up with, again, my favorite 4 words: never hurry, never tarry, and turn it over to other people.
So I think it's really important to also study the loops, study the course, know your cutoff times, and we'll get to this in a minute. But kind of make that plan for your day on how you're going to ride the ride, what you're going to have with your crew, assuming you have crew. I will say, I won't do this ride without crew. I do have friends that have ridden at Cavalry successfully, very successfully. That's a little much for me. You can ride it without crew and send one bag to each check with ride management, but it's so exhausting. This 100, unless you're Bryn, most folks are going to start coming in anywhere between 2 and 5 o'clock in the morning. So literally, as you're vetting through and putting your horse away, the sun is coming back up. So you're going to be exhausted, not only for the entire ride, but also for that drive home. So for me, I won't do it without crew. But study the course. Know that every loop until you get to Big 92 has a major climb on it. Make your plan for when you're going to electrolyte. See, try to talk to some of us, and I'm happy to chat with folks on social media or wherever to kind of give you a layout of the course and tell you where you can make time and where you should be moving out. But if you kind of have that strategy set ahead of time and try to follow that throughout the day, you have a higher chance of being successful in finishing.
I think one of the things you have to this ride will teach you, you're going to learn it here. You're going to learn it on the course if you don't learn it before. And that is to be very, very mindful of what I call your micro pacing. In other words, there's less tolerance on this course for being a little off the schedule, off your best pace for a few minutes or a few hundred yards. In other places around the country where there's lower humidity and less stress, you can be a little more casual about what's exactly the right pace. Oh, you might go a little too fast for a half mile or a mile or so and have some fun, and you can make up for it by just slowing down a little later. That can't happen here. That's where the humidity is really unforgiving. It will force you to be spot on the right pace every stride, every few hundred strides on a much smaller scale, because if you override your pace, even for a half a mile, you'll have to rest by a stream for an hour to make up for that. And it punishes you for being off the micro pacing even a little bit. So the best riders are the ones that start out with a very good idea about what kind of exertion rate their horse is going to take for that day, what he's up to for this day, and dialing in exactly that exertion rate, that level of pressure against his aerobic limits, and staying spot on it every stride. I think that's really important, is just learn to enjoy being very focused on what his exertion level is at this moment and staying as steady to it as you can.
Yeah, and let me just emphasize what John said. The humidity, be very cognizant of the weather. You know, if you have a day with relatively low humidity, 40%, and moderate temperatures, mid 70s, Old Dominion is pretty straightforward. When you get up into 90s, it's a whole different ball game, and the humidity is much tougher on our horses than on runners. In runners, we know that in the 60 temperatures in the mid to high 60s, but humidity in the 80 to 100% range makes a 10 to 15% difference on the performance of elite runners. I think it's much more so on horses, because our horses have fur all over their body, even if we've clipped them. And horses are built like boilers. We're built like radiators. So the toughest times in the Old Dominion, I think, are roughly 8 to 11 in the morning, when that humidity may be still up in the 80 to 95% range. Mid-afternoon, the temperature goes up, but the humidity may have dropped to 50. So that's why save horse. The nice thing about this Old Dominion course is if you get to Big 92, which is the checkpoint at about 2 miles or something. The last part of the whole course is quite straightforward. It's an easy last 25 miles. But the meat of this course, unlike the old classic Old Dominion course, where the longest climb was the last climb from 88 miles into the finish, and the toughest climb was just before that. This has a very straightforward last 25 miles. So save horse, you can pick up time. A lot of that's on open road. You can gallop it at night if you need to.
That's a very important point Stag makes. So I think most of the horses that have cost themselves the most for overheating on this ride, it happens in the witching hour of the late morning. Stad said 8:30, really from about 9:30 to 10:30 most mornings. That's when the rider is still up there going along on the horse, feeling like there's a nice cool morning breeze, and the horse is sitting down there in a sauna. And that's where the humidity level is. That's where the humidity is going to be highest in the day, because it hasn't had a time for the sun to start some thermals and pull the dew away from the ground level. And your horse is just sort of there basking in a sauna. And that's where most of the riders that will overheat their horse make the biggest mistakes on this ride. It's from 9:30 to 10:30 in the morning. By the time it gets to be 2 in the afternoon and it's blazing hot, the riders are aware that it's hot, but it sneaks up on everybody in that early morning hour. When the humidity is high, it's gotten to be a little warm, and the humidity is just skyrocketing.
That's a really good point, John. I feel like that early morning time, again, it almost feels cool to the rider, and it's just it's like a jungle for the horse. I think that is a really sneaky factor you have to account for. And I feel like if you override during that time, that's when you really get into trouble later in the day.
Most common rider error on this course.
Yeah, if you look at photos from last year on the 100, you'll see the most of us riders were in like jackets, like rain jackets and everything. And it felt super cool, but it was actually just because of the humidity was so heavy. It was like riding through a rain cloud. So we literally needed the rain jackets to try and stay dry. So it can be really, really super deceiving. Just again, like Stag said, save your horse, stay ahead of your time, but don't rush it early in the morning, because there's other areas to make up later once the humidity dies down a bit.
When Stagg started talking about 4 words, I thought he was going to not be quoting Matthew, but saying ride your own ride, which is my mantra in the first part of this ride and every ride. When the horse is hot and excited, to me, the best strategy is to go alone, focus completely, that laser focus that John was just talking about pacing. I've got it tuned into the horse. I'm trying to make his experience the least stressful. That means that and my primary focus on 100 is the same as on a 50. I need to find a pocket where that horse is going to have his best performance. And it's most often alone, because that way I can tend to his feet landing in the right rock, or the space in between 2 rocks, and I can tend to the gait that is best for him. My horse that has the big button motors up hills, but needs to do dainty footing going downhill, or my horse that is the opposite, has to slowly go up hills and then fly down. That's not going to be my riding partner's needs for their horse. So I have to focus on my horse, which means train your horse to ride alone. Late in the night, when you're all going slower and the horses are less hot, then to me, that's the time to find a buddy.
Yeah, Claire, I think you're right. You know, I prefer to ride with somebody, but if so, you've got to ride to the weaker of the 2 horses and realize that you may be sacrificing placing on that.
Well, that's too bad for you, Stagg, because I like riding with you, and I know of the 2 of us, I have the weaker horse.
No, not necessarily, but that isn't very, you know, ride your own ride would be the second most important 4 words. I totally agree. And, you know, the only time I intentionally rode to my wife's pace was in the 50-mile national championship at OD, where my plan was to get through the first 2 checkpoints and then rest my horse for an extra hour. So I was setting her up to go. And I had to do that. I mean, we literally did the 3rd loop an hour slower than she did, because I'd asked him of my horse that day. The other, we were talking about ride strategy and crewing. So I just want to make a couple of, well, I'll tell you what, Bob, why don't we let other people talk about ride strategy and then come back to crewing. I do have a couple crewing points I'd like to make.
I'm going to prompt Brenna, if you can talk a little bit about your ride strategy.
In all honesty, my ride strategy changes based upon the horse that I'm riding, as I think it probably should for everyone. If I'm riding, everyone knows Maddie. I feel like everyone assumes I'm riding a gray, I'm riding Maddie. Mares are generally a little smarter. They're a little more independent. They're a little more easier to manage. But when I'm riding Lunar, who I rode for a number of years, Lunar's a gelding. He's a little harder to manage. He's a gelding. He's just a little harder headed. He wants to be up front. I almost always have to ride negative splits with him. I almost always had to ride a little slower up front. And a lot of times at Old Dominion, even if I was riding slower, I got to the point where a lot of people wouldn't want to pass me, just because even if I was setting, as long as I was setting the pace, it didn't matter how fast or slow I was going, people just did not want to pass me. So it still almost looked like I was up front, but like when you compared times, as I know John Crandall has pointed out before, when you compared times for overall, like, you know, first into the first hold, it was nothing significant. I think my ride strategy is always ride to the ability of your horse, ride your own ride. I knew my horses really well. I know what Maddie can do. I know what Lunar can do. I generally know what mares and geldings can do. I never push. If I do push, it's maybe the last 4 or 5 miles. I try and ride the entire ride like I'm not kicking them, like I'm not pushing them forward. I know how it is to be an athlete myself. I know when I'll push myself. I know when I won't. You know, I think that's just a good, you know, I always suggest that everyone goes and be an, go and be an athlete on your own, whether you're running a 5K or you're going to go ride a bicycle. Like understanding that aerobic and anaerobic threshold is just important.
Well, holy smokes, Bryn, I thought I was being an athlete riding it.
I know,
I'm quite an athlete.
I agree with Brenna that like one of the things I tell folks, and not every fully understanding, not everyone is capable, like can for whatever reason, but like one of the best things you can do for yourself and your horse is to like do something like a half marathon where you have a training plan and you actually follow the training plan and do it, and work your way up and do, you know, an event like that, because it really puts into perspective what you're asking your horse to do on race day. And it's easy for me because I grew up as a competitive athlete. So I already had that mentality. When I got older and I started coaching other people and things like that, it kind of was a total culture shock to me that's not a concept that everybody really just knows and is ingrained in them like it is for us. So not everybody's can do that, but if you can, I highly recommend doing that. And also, side note, Brenna, I did my first OD 100, legs and lunar went together the whole day.
I know, Michelle. I remember that. I remember waking up at 4 a.m. and taking pictures. I still have the pictures.
Yeah.
You know,
so I love that horse.
And I not everyone is going to be a runner. I mean, I totally get that. My parents both grew up athletes. They're never going to be runners. I get that. That's not their thing. And I'm not nearly as structured with my horses. Like some of these people on this panel are it's so methodical, and I am not nearly as I'm in school full time. I work full time. I live an hour away from my barn right now. And honestly, I lived in California for about 2 years, and I flew home for races every other week, which was pretty much like I was pretty much spending my entire paycheck to go home and just to go run and ride my horses.
I want your mom to prep my horses.
Yeah, well, that was like the funny thing was no one was prepping my horse. I just showed up and rode. I got really lucky. Like I just got to ride Maddie all season, who was just a natural endurance horse. I didn't get to ride any of my young horses. This season I'm riding all my young horses, but you know, I think just understanding what it feels like to push yourself and having some sort of base to go on, you know, not even necessarily, I mean, also on the horse's part, but also on your own part, just to understand what it feels like to push yourself. It's just a good base for me to say, like, is this worth pushing? Like, is it worth it to go push up this hill? Like, no, not usually. You know, everyone's strategies is a little different. Mine is probably a lot more lackadaisical than the rest of the people on the panel here. But that's just my own.
Bryn, I think you make a great point, a couple points there. I was also a long distance runner long before I was a long distance rider, and I think that helped me. And I used to do a lot of on foot. I'll still get off when I have to walk through the nasty rocks on the OD. I don't do downhill running anymore because my legs, etc. If you do get off and help your horse, make sure you pace yourself, because if you run out of get up and go, you're not going to help your horse. Importantly, our horses, for those who are human athletes, remember horses are very different. We will lose conditioning quickly over a few weeks. Horses, they've done studies and they can actually almost be in a stall and not lose much conditioning for 6 weeks. And if our horses are out in the field running around every day, they basically keep their conditioning. I literally, one of the horses behind me, Druben, he was off all winter. I did 3 rides to condition him. He topped 10 to 50. I gave him 4 or 5 weeks off, other than he would free run with us out on the trail when we're on others. He then topped 10 to 100, and then he had another 4 or 5 weeks off, except for free running with us a couple times, and topped 10 to another 100. They don't, so I think I'm like Brent. I undercondition my horses once I have a base of several years to keep them so they'll have a career of many years. So don't use the insights you get as an athlete, but don't use a human training program on a horse, I think is what I'm trying to say.
It's funny that you would mention the free ponying, because with Mercury, who lasted for so many years and did so well, I never rode him. I always ponied him in the mountains, and he was actually quite wonderful about it. And I think that helped his back stay sound through the years and lessened the stress, and he enjoyed it, which, you know, you can't discount how much the horse's mental wanting to do this sport means to him.
For those who don't know, Merck did the OD 100, the Tevis, and the national championship all in the same year at the age of 27.
And holds the record at Tevis for being the oldest horse to complete, and finished like not far behind me in like what, 13th?
Yeah.
The 1 year.
Yeah.
I
Well,
finished that ride. I thought that was
13.
so fast.
Yeah. And then there was the year that Lynn and I went, and was that the same year? No, it was 17th, 27th, 37th we placed, I think. Yeah, he was a powerhouse. I got to ride next to Claire and Merck at Iron Mountain one year, and it was we had a lot of fun coming down that last loop of trail.
He was an effortless little pony to ride. Sadly, had to put him down a couple months ago.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, so sorry.
He's a legend.
We Lunar and I followed him down trail on Tevis down the canyons. He like led us down the canyons. I mean, and then just an amazing horse. But to go back and to build off of what Stag was saying, it's true. You cannot apply a human training program to a horse's training program. You also can't get that confused. My training program as an athlete is so much different than my horses. Obviously, it's almost like you undertrain your horses and you overtrain yourself in a way. Horses can go so long without losing any condition.
Yeah,
All right.
I think I work out 5 or 6 days a week, and my horse has been on rest for 6 weeks. He was on rest for 4 after 100. And then I broke my finger and I had to have surgery on it. So he's gotten an extra couple weeks. So we're going out.
All right, let's move on to some things. Oh, I'm sorry, Stag, you wanted to talk about tack?
No, I wanted a couple points for crew.
Oh, that's right, crewing. I'm sorry.
Yeah. One, we actually have a checklist, and I can send that to people if they want. We usually forget to check half the things on the checklist, but particularly as you get towards the end of the Old Dominion and riders get brain fatigue or brain fog, I always make sure the first thing when you get into a checkpoint, have your crew check those shoes. Make sure they're all tight and they're all on. In fact, you ought to check shoes as a rider anytime you're letting your horse drink water, etc. Or if you're really good, like John's father, you should always be listening to see if you're hearing for shoes. John's father taught me that. Also make sure your crew, make sure you go out with electrolytes for yourself and your horses. Because it is a ride where I think crew support is so important unless you're going for that cavalry buckle. The other thing I really think strongly, particularly on a tough ride like the OD, is check that horse's pulse and gut sounds just before you go to saddle up. Because a lot of horses, they're so, they're flight reflex animals, and they'll come in, they're still up. So they'll come in, they'll drop their pulse down, they'll hide anything that bothers them, they'll get through the checkpoint. You give them 30, 40 minutes to let themselves down and eat. If that pulse has gone back up, if it's not, continuing to go down, then that says you're got to be really careful give the horse extra time, slow down, et cetera. But that's a great safety check, is checking the gut sounds, the hydration yourself, and the pulse just before you go to put that saddle on the horse.
And that was part of the national championship at Biltmore study, is not right?
That's correct. Yeah,
In
that
2008.
horses that have shown that their pulse has not continued to drop are far less likely not to complete a ride. Now you have to, just how much that dropping is by where you are in the ride and what the heat and humidity is like, but that's a great indicator.
All right, let's move on to things that are unique to the OD. And I guess that's going to be compared to other hundreds, as well as the Tevis and the other hundreds that you've done. Sarah, you want to start this one off?
Sure. Right behind the picture of my best friend. That's my friend Amy in the shirt right there. So OD, I think Claire mentioned it is a one big giant, let's call it a lollipop. It's not really a loop because you do come back and then hit the same trail home other than the last 6 miles or so. So it's not technically a point to point like Tevis is, but it's very similar in mentality because you're kind of doing one big giant continuous loop all day as opposed to doing loops out of the same place in base camp. You have, I think it's 7 or 8 holes, and there are time cutoffs because there's few reasons, and Diane can probably talk more to this than I can. Part of it is because that crew of vets and volunteers, they're leapfrogging those folks between those 8 vet checks all day. So they need to make sure that they stay ahead of the riders that are in front. But there's also kind of a period where, there are areas where you can make up time, but if you get behind a certain point, you're not going to be able to safely continue and catch up in the dark on these very technical trails and actually safely make it to your completion point by the 24 hours. So if you don't make your cutoff time, they will pull you from the ride. Assuming even if your horse is okay, that's your end point. We've already mentioned quite a bit. There's a few rocks. There's quite a few rocks and mud. Pretty much this entire trail, there's very few areas where it's just kind of like nice dirt and grass. The majority of it, you're on gravel road, you're on super technical rock. Sometimes you're coming through mud. So that is way different than any other 100 that I've done. The other thing is, and I mentioned this before, every loop up until Big 92, which is basically mile 72, has a major climb on it. A long stretch. That's a big difference. When you look, I actually have the elevation profiles for both Old Dominion and Tevis, and the elevation change is exactly the same. But the difference is with Tevis, even though you're starting up high and coming down low, it's more rolling the whole way. Whereas Old Dominion, you're going to have a stretch where it feels like, Stag was talking about the second loop. And I love the OD, but I do call it the second loop from hell. Because it's a 17-mile loop and it feels like 15 of those miles are literally up this climb. It's not that bad, but it feels that bad, where you are climbing and climbing and climbing forever. And then you're coming off the ridgeline and you're still climbing. So, you have to have your horse pretty fit in order to get through that. The nice thing about it is because it is a mountain ride, and actually if you're going to do no frills, you'll see this there. It's great for first time horses and riders because it's so technical, it really helps to control that race brain mentality and get out of sight of other horses. So they're not trying to race. They have to focus on where their feet are going. They have to really pay attention to the trail. Otherwise they might fall down, whereas somewhere like Biltmore or Broxton, where you have wide open sweeping trail and perfect footing, they can just kind of run away with it and really overexert themselves. So it really makes it easier to control that pacing and keep control of your horse early on in the day so you can save them for later on in the later miles. Did I miss anything? Anybody else?
Yeah, I would like.
I was going to speak to the cutoff times. Sarah asked, the cutoff times for those that have never done the OD has actually been I've done a 3-year study on the actual times of the fastest rider and the slowest rider who successfully completed the OD. And these cutoff times are based on that, the slowest rider, what time they got out of the vet check and still was able to complete the OD. So that's what they're based on. So yes, it has something to do with the vet leapfrogging to the next vet check, but it truly is, if you don't meet the cutoff time, you can't physically finish this ride. It is based on the slowest successful time that the ride has been completed in. Now stag on.
One other thing, it's not, I would say, unique to the Old Dominion, but I think it's particularly true about the Old Dominion. And that is the culture of, we're all in this together. We're going to help each other. And I've never been in a ride where people are so willing to help, even if it costs them their own time. I mean, one year I was riding with John Crandall and Jeannie Waldron, and somebody had stolen all the markers. And so we were up there front group marking the trail for everybody behind us. And John went on to win, and various people were even using their own toilet paper. And John was riding cavalry to make sure the trail was marked. So that's part of the culture, I think, of Old Dominion. And it's why, when I started the sport, my whole goal was to complete the Old Dominion.
Yeah, I remember one year coming across Tom Haggis on the first loop coming into Birdhaven, and he had lost a shoe, and he knows better. He did not have any boots. So I tossed him my boot so he could get through. And I think he made it through most, if not the entire rest of the day. But I think it is special to the Old Dominion, especially out west. I know, and Kelly could attest to this, where the competition is a little bit different mentality wise, but really on the East Coast in general, both Northeast and Southeast, there's this really great culture of really just watching out for each other and taking care of each other and trying to get as many folks through the ride safely as possible.
I would
think
love to,
one of the things unique about this course is it's got it actually does have exceptionally good water, natural water, and that you'll need to learn to look for it and take advantage of it a lot more than most any other course.
Absolutely. I love competing in Tevis just as much as I love doing Old Dominion. People do go to Tevis acting like it is the Tour de France of endurance racing. People are not usually as willing to help you on trail. I wouldn't say I've ever needed help on trail. I generally try and ride and try to prepare with it to eliminate any possibilities of stress or things going wrong. But I will say, people are much more competitive at Tevis than I think they are at Old Dominion. But, like John said, you need to learn to look for where water is. John actually taught me on trail on specific loops where water is. It's so helpful. I remember to this day, even from 2015, you just got to keep your eye out, but people will always help you there. I mean, you have a question and you can ask, and no one will bat an eye. People will always give you their best answer. The Old Dominion is really there almost as an educational group to just help. I have learned so much from them. It's astounding. As someone who's about to go back for a nursing degree, it's astounding what I've learned from Old Dominion, just to apply from horses to humans. So yeah, I mean, to things unique to the Old Dominion. It's almost as if you have a question, just ask. There's a million things that are unique to Old Dominion, but if you have any questions, you're welcome to ask.
And it is interesting, you guys talking about Tevis and just rides out west in general. And I have to say Tevis is a little different from the other rides I've experienced out west. You guys talking about just the camaraderie and just kind of, you know, going rain, seeing, you know, knowing where water is, having a on trail and just the challenges that are unique to the Old Dominion. I actually think that the Bighorn 100 has a lot of similarities with the Old Dominion. I know it's a little off topic. We're mostly talking about the Old Dominion with some hints there, here and there towards Tevis, but I just had to at least throw that in there, that every time I've been at Bighorn, I love that ride. And part of the reason I love it so much is because it really reminds me of the Old Dominion. And I don't know, just kind of has a lot of those really raw, natural elements that are just so unique to the Old Dominion. You just don't really get those with a lot of other hundreds in the United States.
I think also one thing, if you're geared up or gearing up to go do a new ride, an iconic ride like this, is take the time to read up on the history of some of these trails. And perhaps Diane or someone else can speak to whether the history of the Old Dominion, is that still on our website?
Actually, if they go to the Endurance News, we've had several articles. One is about the history of the Old Dominion, and then another article is about the history of the trails. And our article that's coming out in April is a lot of people like Kelly and some others that the OD was their first 100 and they were successful. Them talking about their experiences and what a euphoric high it was to be riding at night. I think that's Sarah Mountain talking about the fireflies and just being in a magical place. So we have put articles in Endurance News, I think 4 out of the last 6 months, and go find those articles and it'll give you a good history of the OD.
And the whippoorwill.
So for instance, one very challenging trail on the Old Dominion that is also at it's also part of our April ride, I believe, is the Mail Trail.
Yes.
The Mail Trail. And
Last
everybody
big climb
that's
of the
done these
day.
rides know the Mail Trail. I mean, but it's named that way because it was the trail that somebody, rather the mailman, I guess, rode to deliver mail, right? And John, you know more about that, right?
Yeah, that was the mail service route from Woodstock, from the post office in Woodstock out into West Virginia.
And for participants that are considering coming to the OD and have never ridden it, what Claire is talking about is No Frills Trail is the backside of the 100. The second loop of the OD trail is actually on the part of the trail that goes into Bucktail, comes out of Bucktail through Waits Run and heads to Big 92. So you actually would get a good practice ride in if you came to No Frills.
Yeah, and the Mail Trail,
Perfect training.
the Mail Trail is the last really nasty stretch of rock you hit on the Old Dominion. You hit it about 65 miles out. And my horse, JL Super, after doing it the first time, told me, if you want to do it again, get your ass out of the saddle and walk up it with me.
Yeah, and it's really not the climb on that section that's the worst part. It's coming off of it and eventually getting down to Waits Run. But you know, it all comes back to you know, you can know all these places and trail, and if you come and ride the OD, chances are there's gonna be veterans that have done it before and will like be happy to sit there and chat with you and help you, you know, give you information to get through it. And that I think is also something that's unique to OD is, you know, again, talking about Tevis or even Biltmore, which the May ride is kind of high energy with the FEI involvement. I don't know if we're doing that this year or not, Stag.
No FEI, it's ARC only.
But like you really have folks that are passionate about it and are happy to like chat and mentor and help you develop a plan to get through it the whole way. And that's pretty unique to Old Dominion.
Same thing works in the crew area too. If you've got something you need, talk to one of the crew people because they're more than happy probably to to loan it to you or help you with it.
I remember the year that the rain started a few years ago and the temperatures dropped. I went to my truck and drug out all my horse blankets I had to throw on horses coming in off the 100. I'm a new member to OD, a new member to all of this, and I've seen everyone jumps in and helps you. It's an amazing community.
Oh,
And what I will say is another thing that's unique to the OD 100 is what you're talking about, the cruise, because there's only one vet check the cruise can't come to. It's a rolling social party because everybody rushes to the next vet check. They get all set up and then everybody's socializing. And as they were just saying, if you forgot your electrolytes, you run out of electrolytes, or you don't have a blanket for your horse, people are bending over backwards to get whatever you need. The year that they're talking about the hail and the temperatures dropping 40 degrees, Claire, I think you lost your canopy and half of your stuff. And before you got in there, it was all taken down, gotten out of the way, and had reset your area before you ever got in there.
Absolutely. I remember that.
One thing, actually, Diane, you just reminded me of that is somewhat unique to OD is the second checkpoint in both the 50 and the 100 is a no crew checkpoint because it's such tight quarters. Now the OD volunteers do a wonderful job of having food and hay for your horses and grain, and also food for people and all. But it is if you've got electrolytes you particularly like, food for your horses you particularly like, food for yourself you particularly like, you need to send that out, prepare that as a packet and send that out and be very thoughtful about that and have it very well labeled because you won't have crew at that second checkpoint. You will have lots of support from the great volunteers. And that I guess is also similar to some of the checkpoints at Tevis, but that's not something you experience at Biltmore where a check is back at camp or a lot of other 100-mile rides.
I don't know of any other rides right now that have a cavalry division. Does anybody?
That's also true.
Yeah, I was just about to bring that up because we started talking about crew.
Right.
But
So
yeah, OD does
if you
have
go on the Old Dominion website, you can read about the rules and of being a cavalry rider. You do not, if you cannot muster, if you're 60 miles in and you lose a shoe and you can't nail your own shoe on, then you simply drop out of it. But it's a very unique challenge. Have great pictures of my husband at the completion of the 100-mile ride. You still can't accept any help, not even holding your horse. Got a great picture of my husband, me riding his favorite horse, and him wanting so much to grab and hug the horse, and he's got his hands tied behind his back like this, talking to me, because otherwise his hands would be all over that horse. But a great challenge.
My mom showed up at Big 92 and she had tears in her eyes. It was so hard for her to stand there and not help.
That was the first year I did it, actually next to Brenna's horse Lunar. The lady that was riding him was riding cavalry, and she got behind in her hydration and got super sick the last half of the ride. And it was everything I could do. I kept asking her, like, if you just want to drop cavalry, I have plenty of water and Gatorade and stuff for you. And she wouldn't do it. She stuck it out, but that was brutal to watch.
All right, let's move it on to the question and answer portion of it. See if we've got any questions in the chat that we need to get answered, and maybe we'll wrap it up a little bit.
This is the extras. We do have this extra slide. This was so if anyone thought of something while they were speaking they wanted to add.
We do have one question that hasn't been answered is what kind of considerations does somebody need if they're riding a stallion?
Cool. The first is to let ride management know. We usually require corral panels versus electric for a stallion. I have in the past, depending on the talking to the owner of the stallion and the stallion's behavior, we've tried to put them either at one end of ride camp or the other to try to reduce the effect on the mares coming into season. And at No Frills, one year, we actually put an area separate for the stallion, well-behaved stallion, but we didn't want issues with all the mares, and the horse went through just fine. So if you're bringing a stallion to the ride, please contact me directly so we can talk through what would be the best setup for camp for you.
Yellow ribbon on the tail.
Oh, yes, yellow ribbon on the tail too.
We
I'd say
have,
make sure they pulse down before you show up to a ride.
we
I
have,
I have run into
another-
that personally.
We have another question. We have a couple that hadn't been answered yet, but sort of we've answered them. What type of conditioning versus rest versus competition would you recommend between a 50 at No Frills and the OD 100?
Depends on the horse. How much he's done in the past. Whether you're just building him up or he's a seasoned competitor. Depends on what your goals are. I have one horse that that I'm trying to continue to get mileage on. It's important to me, so that's, you know, continuing to put as many miles on him as I can with that, it being safe is important. But if you're talking about a horse that's maybe done a couple of other hundreds, then you get into how does he do? How does he look after the last 50? Were his legs puffy? This kind of thing.
I think it's important that you look at the No Frills ride as a pre-test. And what you need to work on from there on, getting ready for the 100, is whatever wasn't your strength at the No Frills ride.
Good point.
Yeah, I typically use the Biltmore Challenge to get ready because my wife's ride manager and if I went up and did the No Frills, I'd be in big trouble. But I think doing a ride 5 to 7 weeks ahead of time is great. And again, I'll just reemphasize what Claire said, depends on the horse. So literally with JL Super, I would ride the Biltmore ride is basically a prep ride for the 100, and he won that ride a couple of years, but I was just riding the horse's pace, but he was a, you know, great athlete. This year I'll do that ride as a 50 and then let the horse tell me what else he needs in prep. But I think doing some ride 5 to 7 weeks ahead of time makes sense. Although, I mean, John, I think, has done the OD 100 as a horse's first endurance ride, but you'd put years of careful preparation, right?
Yeah, well, I've done the Tevas as a horse's first endurance ride. And it's 10th.
And for those participants,
But-
the No Frills they're talking about is April 15th and 16th in Star Tannery, Virginia. On John's property.
Yeah, I would, I always use No Frills as the ride to kind of see where my horse is at fitness wise. I don't do a whole lot of conditioning throughout the winter. I usually use that semester to go kind of heavy on school. So I don't do a whole lot of training then. But after Mustang Memorial, which is coming up actually this upcoming weekend, I usually like to just see where my horses are at. Whether it's doing the LD or the 50, depending on the horse and their base miles. I think it gives me a good insight into how fit they are, where they're going to be in June. So I always recommend doing No Frills. I think it's honestly probably a little harder than the Old Dominion, just 50 to 50, not necessarily 50 to 100. And it just gives you a good idea of where they're at and what to work on.
So do I need to save your parking space, Bren?
Yes, you do. Yes, because I can't back up.
We got
Thanks.
another question on what everyone's suggestion is for good gut sounds.
Ooh.
Good gut sounds, I guess, I'm gonna quote Matthew McKay Smith. Either they got them or they ain't. I think the volume is less important than, listening for 30 seconds and making sure you've got, gut sounds there. And again, knowing your horse, every horse is different, but if you're not hearing them at all, that's a really big red flag. I should
Particularly if you're not hearing them in more than one quadrant. It's more important to check more locations.
Yeah.
Don't worry about whether trying to grade it an A or a B or a C, because it's either a pass fail really.
Yeah, and John's exactly right. Check all 4 quadrants.
I would add that in 2014, which was the very first year that I did the OD 100, and I was riding Maddie, who's my mother's horse, and I'd never really ridden Maddie before on my own. Maddie didn't eat the entire first probably 45 miles until we got to Birdhaven. No, sorry, not Birdhaven. It was right before Big 92. What is that hold? Staggerman. Bucktail. Yes. Sorry, another B. Maddie didn't eat anything until coming into that fold. And she always had gut sounds, but they weren't great. And I just kept letting her do her thing. And anyway, eventually she came into Bucktail and started eating, and she was ravenous. And then she was even more ravenous coming into Big 92 and continued eating throughout the day. But for the first half of the day, I mean, she had no appetite at all. And I would never say to go off of that, but that was really like a freak thing. That was very much it. Sometimes that's just how she operates. She's done the same thing at Tevis. She's done the same thing in later years. And honestly, I've had other horses in later years do the same things, but they've always had gut sounds. They have always had something. They will pick, but they're not going to be ravenous. As long as the horse is eating at the bare minimum, I usually let them keep going, but I don't, like I said before, I'll never push them. I never want to push them at all, usually until maybe the last loop, even if then. And anyone else goes beyond that.
For me, not eating is a pretty big red flag. For mine,
Yeah, absolutely.
but as you say, you need to know the horse.
Absolutely.
That gut, like listening to gut sounds, that can be a little subjective, or if like the wind's blowing, it can be hard to hear. So I really feel like, Claire, what you just said is really important, because if you have a horse that's like super bright and is chowing down and eating everything you put in front of them, that is a very different scenario. You have a horse that's standing there quiet, and then you feel like you don't have gut sounds in that horse. To me, that's really much more concerning than, if I just can't really agree gut sounds, but the horse is and every other parameter looking fantastic. I think that's much different.
Yeah, there's another simple saying that if people aren't familiar with it, that I think is very important. EDPP. If EDPP is okay, you're in good shape. And if it's not, then you better start figuring out what's going on. That stands for eating, drinking, peeing, and pooping. If the horses are eating, drinking, peeing, and by peeing, I mean it's, good color, not tea color, not coffee color, but good volume. They say, you're an endurance rider if you embarrass your friend in the woods and your friend sees you in the woods and you comment, good volume, nice color. So the peeing and then the pooping looks normal, then your horse is probably just doing fine. So your point's well taken. Know your horse and evaluate the horse.
And I think people talk a lot about the appearance of urine, but maybe they don't spend enough time talking about the appearance of manure on trail. Essentially, the things to look for in manure that are troublesome are mucus coating, and dryness, and difficulty defecating is another thing that's indicating dryness or muscular fatigue as well. And that's all I have to say about manure.
Yeah, endurance riders do like to watch our horses poop and pee.
So there was a question earlier. Do you feed your horse in any special manner or in a different way throughout the OD 100?
Not for me. Like I literally whatever he wants to eat, and especially because his taste on what he wants to eat changes throughout the day. So I make sure I have hay, grain. I do have a grain that I don't feed at home normally that I offer him because he seems to really like that. I offer him beet pulp. He doesn't eat much of that. But essentially just having that buffet out, and earlier on in the day he likes more grain, later on in the day he likes more hay. I mean, obviously it's different than what we feed at home, because at home he basically gets 2 square meals a day with hay and grain, and that's it. Whereas now we're like feeding whatever he can eat all day, or she, depending on the horse. But really it's whatever they want to eat, offering that in front of them and making sure that they have something they like. But so yes, it's different than at home because he gets different options. Different from the ride than at home because it's more important that he eats. Sorry, there's a question in the chat if y'all didn't see it. Why do I feed different than on the ride at home? I offer him his normal grain that he gets at home, but typically he's gonna want what is different. If you're riding with a friend, for example, then he's gonna want that friend's food because it's different than what he normally gets. So I'd rather have him eat something that's different than so that he is eating, than have him kind of turn his nose up on the thing that he always gets and maybe doesn't look quite as good. I do feed the morning. The next question that came up was, do you feed the morning of the ride? I do feed about 2 hours before the ride start. And I feed his normal breakfast like he would get any other day. I do know several riders that don't do that. And I also know riders that, like, for example, when they're traveling out to Tevis, really drop the amount of grain that they're feeding on the way out there to help prevent tie-up. And kind of that sugar rush early on in the morning. My particular horse, again, he's well over a decade team. He's going on 18 this year, although he thinks he's 10. So I don't necessarily have that problem, but there's a few different schools of thought there. So you can feed lighter, you can not feed early or in the morning, or you can feed like normal. It's totally up to your individual horse and how they perform the best.
Yeah, I'm like you. I like to give my horse a buffet because I want him eating and giving him lots of choices. And again, it depends on your horse. When I got into the sport, I was told, don't feed alfalfa. It burns too hot. Don't let him have much grain. I was at the Race of Champions, and the horse stable next to us was given free choice of alfalfa and free choice of grain at the checkpoints. And that horse was R.O. Grand Sultan, who won 3 world championships. So much for the conventional advice that I was given when I started the sport. So it goes back to know your horse, but I like what you Sarah just said about, give your horse lots of choices so they will eat something.
Oh, come on, John, give us your secrets.
Oh, actually, I pretty much concur with most of what the rest of you said. I've usually fed my horses about 2 hours before, usually a normal feeding. For most of them, that means an electrolyte dose in the feeding. I had the advantage of using the Enduramax in the Middle Eastern dry version, and it actually, I think, was a little more palatable mixed with the feed. It was more starchy than sugary, and they seemed that seemed to go well in their feed, and they didn't mind it. So that's what they usually got in the morning, about 2 hours before. I don't think it's any advantage, or probably a disadvantage, to feed much closer than that to the start.
We
Okay.
had
I'm sorry,
one
go ahead.
more question. Sorry, we had one more questions from earlier on about pads. Is it Soul Guard that is used?
That's what I use,
Okay.
Soul Guard. It's actually, I'm getting feedback that it's getting, so we always poured it in the day before, a couple days before ride. And you got to work it up under the edge of the shoe in the sole to get it to stay on. And then after the ride, we would just take a sharp hook and pull it out, rather than have it be in the foot for the whole shoeing cycle, which is an advantage to it over putting a leather pad in or plastic pad. But Pete tells me that it's getting, the newer version of it's getting really hard to pull out. I have had sole guards stick to the sole even when the shoe's gone. So that's kind of cool when that happens. You still have protection. It's made to be used in that way, actually. It's made to be used instead of a shoe. Actually, I haven't had that much good luck using it that way, but more than once the shoes come off and the sole guard has remained.
And it's important not to overstuff it. Your horse is supposed to have a little bit of concavity in their foot, and they don't have a lot of tolerance for it to be mounded up, to make them bear extra pressure in the center. It's really good to be there, but make sure it's not overstuffed and it has at least a little bit of concavity across the shoe.
Anytime if you put stuff like this in your foot, you're remember that you're locking that foot into a certain shape for however long you leave it in. So there's going to be less natural spread at footfall of the foot. I think. Is that right, Kelly?
We've been using Equipack with the copper sulfate sub. And we're spoiled out here. It's so dry. We can just leave it on for the whole cycle. It gets Virginia very well.
That's a little softer though.
The Equipack. Yeah, we'll usually fill the hole with the shoe if we're using a composite, but like John said, being careful it's not mounding up out of there. There's a little concavity in it.
I think that's all the questions that we've had. You guys have been amazing in answering all these questions.
Okay, then I think we'll call it an evening. And I want to thank all of you folks for being here and answering all these questions, taking time out of your day.
Volunteers, Bob. Sorry.
Well,
A call for
we'll get there. I'm not going to shut everybody
okay.
down. I promise. But like I say, I want to thank everybody that took time out of their evenings, and especially Rand, since she's over there at 3 o'clock in the morning. Thank you very much for your time. Go ahead, Diane, with your commercial.
For those participants that are still on, if you've listened to this and you're not sure that you can do the 100, or even if you're going to come do the 100, we're always looking for volunteers. Most people come in for the whole duration. They'll ride one day and then they'll volunteer the other. If you're new to endurance and you're really not sure about doing the OD, but you really want to come and learn more about the sport and about the Old Dominion, it is a great opportunity to come and volunteer at either No Frills in April or at the National Championship in June. And the hyperlinks are on the PowerPoint that Sonia sent to you.
And I will pop in and right here. I know Stag, you mentioned about a checklist, and I would actually love a copy of that. I know I've had a lot of people ask, well, has this webinar been recorded? Yes, it has. I will be sending out a YouTube link later to anyone who's registered for an OD webinar with links to our YouTube channel, so you can access this webinar and past webinars. This will take a little bit to get this one on, but you can at least access some of our past webinars too. And then
Stag, will you share your checklist?
Yeah, I will send it to Sonia and then she can make
will
it
send it.
available, or people can also email me directly, either way.
I will, if everyone, the panelists are okay, I can send everyone emails, if they have specific questions for people.
Sure.
Okay.
A lot of us are on Facebook too. Not everyone, but so if you're on Facebook or social media, that's another good way to reach out to us if you have other questions and follow up.
Thank you.
Thank you all. It was great.
Diane, thank you for all the work you do. You're amazing.
Amen.
Thank you, Diane.
Thank you all for doing the panel.
Thank you
Putting
very
the panel
much,
together,
folks.
Bob and Diane
Thank you
and
so much, Diane.
Sonia.